we actually know very little about Italian church architecture before the age of Constantine. If you remember, the year 313 was the emancipation of Christianity under Constantine after the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. The first reference that we really have to any sort of church in Italy, though, is from the book of Romans, where Paul says, "Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus. They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. Greet also the church that meets in their house." That's all we know. A church was meeting in Rome sometime around the year 60. Probably several were, and we also know that St. Paul rented a house while he was in Rome under prison, and people would come to visit him. So assuming that was also some sort of an early church experience. Now, we tend to call these things, these early churches, before churches became formalized and before the church actually owned property, either the Domus Ecclesia, which translates into house of the church, or the Ecclesia Domesticate, which is like the domestic house, the domestic church. We have very little actual archaeological evidence. Let's see, here we go. Recently, in the past 40 years or so, the excavations in Capernaum revealed a house, which was, well, actually, this was the original first century house, a series of rooms close around a courtyard, that at some point was dedicated over to Christian worship. This is called the House of Peter in Capernaum. And it's a fairly important site because in the 6th century, they put a martyrion, which is like an octagonal shaped building over all of this, which then, so once they excavated, they found something very important. But we really know very little about, I think a lot of these are just kind of archaeological attributions. They did some modifications to make larger rooms, entryways, and so forth. There's another instance in Dura Europos, which is in modern day, I think it's Syria, near Aleppo, where there's this tiny little house along a street with, this is definitely a Christian building. There was a little baptistry here. There was kind of, they knocked out some walls to make larger assembly spaces. And they think that perhaps this here was the actual church, which was actually two parts. There was like some sort of proscenium, there was a place for the bishop, or maybe there was an altar there. But there was also already this kind of language of a separation of the nave and sanctuary fairly early on. Other examples before Constantine, in Rome itself, Santa Pudenziana, the original chapel there, they've excavated that. That dates to about the year 140 AD, very early. At San Giovanni a Paolo, there are a series of rooms with Christian iconography dating from the 2nd century. But again, this is very, very, very thin evidence to go on. A lot of what we can gather from the early church experience is from Eusebius, who was a historian. He was Constantine the Great's historian. He wrote the life of Constantine, and he wrote a very important history of the church. Now, a lot of scholars call into question his reading of things, but he does talk about before the persecutions under Decius in particular, which were around the year 250 roughly. There were these great churches that were, the church owned property and had special purpose-built buildings throughout the Roman Empire. We have very, very little evidence of that. Recently in Aqaba, which is modern-day Jordan, they've excavated a pre-Constantinian basilica from maybe the year 290. But again, that's still subject to interpretation. So my point here, of course, is just that this is dim memory in the Christian faith. But Eusebius did leave us with an important document. He actually wrote in his life in the history of the church. He talks about this recovery that happened after the persecutions under Maximian. And the rise again of churches. He says, after these persecutions, all men living were free from oppression by the tyrants and released from their former miseries, and all in their various ways acknowledged the only true God, the defender of the godly. He talks about the fact that from these places that had been reduced to dust by the tyrant's wickedness, coming back to life, the cathedrals were again rising from their foundations high into the air, far surpassing in magnificence those previously destroyed by the enemy. Now, there's other textual evidence for church-owned buildings before the emancipation of Constantine. Tertullian and Origen both allude to it. Part of the problem for scholars, for archaeologists trying to figure out what's going on, is that we consider that at the time of, say, the persecution of Decius in the year 250, roughly. It deliberately destroyed a lot of Christian culture, but Christian culture was minuscule at that point. Maybe there were as many as 1 million Christians in the entire Roman Empire, which was under 2% of the population. So looking for any kind of pre-Constantinian Christian artifact is like looking for a needle in a haystack. So when we do find things, we tend to kind of blow them, so that's what the whole thing's about. It really doesn't work that way. What I want to concentrate on in this talk is giving a brief overview of Italian church architecture and the themes of architectural symbolism that the church has used from her adolescence, and then look at a couple of ways that the church has used architecture to express her concerns of the age, her mission, her theology, to whatever was the contemporaneous situation of the time. Getting back to Eusebius, a very important document that he left us is a chapter in his History of the Church on the dedication of the cathedral at Tyre. Tyre is a modern, well, it's in dust today, but it was a church that was dedicated in the year 315, only 2 years after Constantine's emancipation, and some 9 years or so before, like, the Lateran Basilica was built as a church. Eusebius's themes in this show a very rich, complex, well-thought-out understanding of church architecture and of the church, broadly speaking, the ecclesia, those who are gathered by God. He's already invoking themes of the tent of dwelling, the temple of the Holy Spirit, the heavenly Jerusalem. He first reminds the audience that the bishop of Tyre, Paulinus, is the heir to a great tradition of sacred building. He says, friends of God and priests, clothed with the sacred vestments and the heavenly crown of glory, the divine unction and priestly garments of the Holy Spirit, and you, speaking to Paulinus, the bishop, so young, yet the pride of the holy temple of God, honored with ripe wisdom from God, yet renowned for the precious works and deeds of virtue in the prime of your youth. His hand has bestowed the supreme honor of building his house upon earth and reestablishing it for Christ, his only begotten and firstborn Son, and for Christ's holy and majestic bride. Shall I call you the new Bezalel, the master builder of the divine tabernacle? Or Solomon, a king of a new and far nobler Jerusalem? Or a new Zerubbabel, who adorned the temple of God with the glory that was far greater than the old? So already he's calling this bishop who's building this building, he's already tying him into this tradition of the temple, the tent of dwelling, the heavenly Jerusalem. We don't know what this church looked like in Tyre, but we have a relatively near contemporaneous grand building. This is the old St. Peter's before it was taken down in the 16th century and rebuilt in the 17th. Let me read through this a bit more. He's describing the way the bishop chose to build the building. He took in an area that was much larger than just the church proper, a precinct, in other words. And he gave the whole outer enclosure the protection of walls that surround the whole to provide maximum safety for the entire structure. He opened up a gateway, wide and towering, to receive the rays of the rising sun. Now, this is important because that means it's oriented towards the east. Thus providing even those who stood on the outside the sacred precinct with an unlimited view of the interior so that people could see through, so that no one should hurry past without being profoundly moved by the thought of the former desolation and the miraculous transformation now. He hoped that perhaps emotion at the mere sight would turn people and propel them towards the entrance. So at an early time, the church is already using the building itself as a way of communicating to a largely pagan culture. He does not permit a man who has passed inside the gates to go at once with unhallowed and unwashed feet into these holy places within. We see the courtyard here with the fountain. He left a very wide space between the church proper and the first entrances, which would be right here, adorning it all around with 4 colonnades at right angles, so that the outer walls turn the site into a quadrangle and pillars rise on every side. The space between those he's filled with wood trellises to a proportionate height. In the middle, he left a clear space where the sky can be seen so that the air is bright and open to the sun's rays. There he placed symbols of sacred purification, constructing fountains exactly in front of the cathedral to enable those who are proceeding towards the center of the sacred precinct to purify themselves. For all who enter this first stopping place, lending beauty and splendor to the whole, and at the same time providing those in need of elementary instruction in the stations they require. The point being here is that he's creating a sense of procession for inviting pagan and Christian into kind of a journey into the building. Now, for all of Eusebius is waxing eloquently on the grandeur of this building. The purpose of the building is not merely to inspire awe or to get simple folks to marvel at glittery things and become attracted to the Christian church. For Eusebius, the beauty of the building is not an end in itself, not even a means to an end, but rather a proper expression of the beauty of Christ and of his church. It's a sacramental presentation of a sacred heavenly reality. He says that the cathedral is a marvel of beauty, utterly breathtaking, especially to those who have eyes only for the appearances of material things. But all marvels pale before the archetypes, the metaphysical prototypes, the heavenly patterns of material things. He's working in a very kind of Platonic sense here. I mean the reestablishment of the divine spiritual edifice in our souls. Suddenly he's drawing another relationship between the church proper, the church building, and church, kind of the interior life of the Christian. The themes that he's developing here, things like the temple, the tent of dwelling, the temple of Solomon, are all kind of the major archetypes that he's trying to relate to the Christian community here. He goes here and says that more than mere living stones, he's trying to draw. He also uses that Petrine analogy from St. Peter, that we are all living stones that incorporate the church. He mentions that the bishop is ordering the whole community according to a church building. He's drawing an analogy between the local church assembled in Tyre and the building itself. He says, building truly in righteousness, he equitably divided the people according to their powers, Those who are strong with unwavering faith, he created as enclosure walls. Those were the greater number of souls whose faith was strong, but not yet strong enough to support the church proper. So, a lot of us probably would have wound up just as like the enclosure walls. Some souls were placed at door frames to the church, whose task it was to guide those seeking entrance into the kingdom, those who were more evangelical. Those who were just learning the faith were placed as supports for the courtyard columns. Realizing that when we enter the church through the quadrangular courtyard, since we enter the church through the four Gospels, bringing them for the first time into touch with the letter of the four Gospels, that there's a process where he's also drawing kind of a whole he's layering this with another kind of evangelical metaphor about how we come to know Christ, how we come to know his church through the proclamation of the Gospels. Those advancing in learning and holiness were placed along the interior walls of the basilicas, taking those, quote, undefiled souls, purified like gold from the divine washing, that is from baptism, as underprops to the pillars, much grander than the outer ones. So he's just, this is a fascinating text because he's just layering and layering and layering and drawing simultaneous analogies between the universal church, the particular church, the church building, the local community assembled. And as the souls make up the stones of the church, so the central stone in the church, quote, the great, solemn, and unique altar is the soul of the great high priest of the Holy of Holies, Christ himself. So we see by the multivalent character of this oration, we realize he's not merely talking about the church of the cathedral at Tyre or about the local community, but about the souls of the faithful and their place in the heavenly pattern, the whole ecclesia, which he calls the great cathedral, which throughout the whole world, under the sun, the great creator of the universe, the Word, has built. It's a complex analogy that keeps folding back on itself because it's following, for Eusebius, a celestial pattern that is, quote, the Jerusalem above. It is called the heavenly Mount Zion, the celestial city of God. Right from the very beginning, we already have these great archetypes worked out. That's why I kind of wanted to dwell on that text a bit, because before the church really started building vigorously, we already had this language. In my estimation, that it's so well worked out, this probably predates Eusebius. This is probably, an argument can be made that this is pretty early on, even from scriptural times, when St. Paul is talking about James and Cephas and John are the pillars that build up the church. These metaphors have continually informed our understanding of church architecture. Let's move on a bit here to the Roman Basilica, because this became the main dominant type, especially in Italy, and by extension the whole Roman Empire. Now the Basilica was the Roman Hall of Justice. There were perhaps other uses for the Basilica as well, including markets, public forums, and so forth. But it was basically, one of its imperial uses was the place where the judges sat as representatives of Caesar to adjudicate disputes. These were large public spaces. They would have been roofed over. This is a small basilica in Rome at the Imperial Palace, which has been, of course, reconstructed. This is the larger Basilica Ulpia, also in Rome. Notice the dates, about 110 and 85. So they're contemporaneous with early Christianity. Large covered spaces with rows and rows of columns to define the central courtyard. Apses on each end. Sometimes there'd be two apses, sometimes there'd be one apse, sometimes there'd be an apse in the middle. A lot of different variations of this. But this is basically what they call the Basilican format. A reconstruction and artist's interpretation of the Basilica of Maxentius. where you can see the central naos, the nave, the apse, the statue of the emperor inside. Why the Christians took this form? I think there are very pragmatic reasons. For one thing, it was a large open space that could gather a lot of people with clear story lighting. It allowed a certain amount of illumination inside so that people could not stumble about. But I think there's also, Joseph Rickwer gives an interesting interpretation of this, that essentially they took this space at the imperial age, that is the age of Constantine, because for now, this was the Roman law court, but the law of Christ has superseded that and has assumed that law tradition. So now, instead of the statue of the emperor, would sit the bishop. And instead of where the judge would be at one end, because he's Christ's representative to teach, to adjudicate, to administrate the sacraments. Instead of an altar of incense where the plaintiff and the defendant would come and offer a sacrifice of incense for a good verdict, it became the altar of the true sacrifice in Christ. So the church adopted this language of sacred art, of judicial imperial basilican architecture to its own advantage, taking those themes that people would have recognized and given it a Christian interpretation. Now we can think of the basilica, the Christian basilica, as kind of a hierarchical processional path from the street through an arcade, through a courtyard, through a narthex, down the nave, to the altar with the apse behind. It's very much, the church is still trying to figure out what the big scene is here in terms of the theology of the church. When you consider also that this is a time of great confusion and opinion going on within the church regarding some very primary questions that we might take for granted today. This is before the Nicene Creed, for instance. This is before, contemporaneous with Chalcedon and Ephesus and so forth, that the things that we take for granted about how the Trinity works or who it is or so forth, this is all in flux, but the church did have the understanding that it was oriented towards heaven. And so these basilicas are very much church in movement, church heading towards a destiny which is heaven itself. And so you move through these buildings and you arrive at the apse with these glorious mosaics that express the arrival, the completion, the fullness of heaven. Now, the Christian plan of the basilica, especially in Rome, and in general the Constantinian basilicas, the ones that Constantine himself endowed, such as several of them in the Holy Land, they tend to be oriented towards the east. This is St. John Lateran, set in the modern, this is the Baroque city of Rome, but you can see that it's oriented towards the east. The doors are towards the east. St. Peter's is roughly towards the east. This isn't constant, but my understanding of this is that since it is the successor and the fulfillment of the tent of dwelling, which in Scripture talks about the entry doors were to the east, and the Temple of Solomon facing the east, this is a very deliberate evocation of temple architecture, of the whole Jewish tradition of sacred space. Now, the first recorded Christian use of the term basilica was the Lateran. This is obviously a Renaissance or Baroque facade done in the, I think, 17th century. This is on the site of the Lateran Palace, which had belonged to Fausta, which was Constantine's wife. It was given over to the church. Very early on in the year 313, there are documents that the church was gathering there to discuss the Donatist dispute. What do we do with people who lapse from the faith under the persecutions? That was not, and they use the word basilica in those texts, but that's not that's probably not a religious building. That's more of an assembly space that would have had the Grand Hall, for instance, that would have been in the Imperial Palace. The Cathedral of St. John Lateran is actually this is a later title, St. John for San Giovanni the Baptist, and the Lateran for the Lateran Palace. Its actual original title is the Basilica of the Savior. This is the first church in Christianity dedicated to our Lord, and specifically has become the seat of, this is the Cathedral of Rome. We all think about the Vatican as the Pope's cathedral. That's a basilica. This is where his chair is. This is where he governs the church from, in that more emblematic sense. Now, before leaving this important church, and this is really the most important church, I have to comment that I could give this entire lecture on tracing church architecture from Byzantine to Baroque to the present, just with this building. Okay. It was the jewel of Christianity until it was destroyed or sacked by the Vandals in 555. Pope Leo the Great restored it a few years later. Pope Hadrian I restored it in the 8th century. In 896, it was almost totally destroyed by an earthquake. The rebuilt church was proportioned to the old foundations to match the existing. Here's a plan of it. This is a Renaissance plan, but it's kind of illustrative. So basically, they built upon the foundations with a double-columned basilica with a central nave and the apse at one end. This apse was later moved farther back. It was probably closer here. But essentially, the bones of it are pretty much the same. That church was burnt to the ground in the 13th century. The rebuilt third church was destroyed and rebuilt after another fire. By the Baroque age, the building was in such disrepair that they were going to tear it down, like they did to St. Peter's. And instead they built what we see today for St. Peter's. But Pope Innocent X didn't want to tear it down, and he had the architect Borromini stabilize the building. And what Borromini actually did, and you can kind of see this in plan, is he encrusted these central pillars in big pilasters. So you can see kind of the line of where the grid would be, the structural grid. And he took these and encrusted, so he kind of made, the whole church becomes like a reliquary, encasing an ancient Constantinian basilica. So we have no real memory of that. But what we have instead is this really glorious Baroque space. And Borromini went at great length to express this building as the heavenly Jerusalem in his own way, for his own time. These monumental statues, you can see how tall a person is here. So beautifully proportioned that until you see how tall a person is, you don't have a sense of that, of the grandeur of this space. The 12 apostles, with their names written at the base, alluding very directly to that vision in the book of Revelation, where it talks about the heavenly Jerusalem, with the names of the apostles written on the foundations. And then he goes into all kinds of elaborate iconography with these Corinthian columns that are actually palm branches, because the palm branch is a symbol of the heavenly Jerusalem as well. And so there's a lot going on in this building that today we have this kind of Baroque expression here. These statues are really just wonderful, done by Rusconi and Legros in the 17th and 18th centuries. Very, very powerful kinds of Baroque forms. Now, another adaptation of the basilica was the adding of the bema, which is this area here. Not every basilica has it. This is St. Paul outside the walls. The bema here is derived from the Jewish synagogue, which is where the elders would sit. In the early church, it was probably used for the deacons and the priests and the minor orders. So the lay people were kind of in the nave down here. This begins to give the shape of kind of a tau cross, right? Well, in the year 382, this isn't the image, but in the year 382, St. Ambrose dedicated a church to the Holy Apostles in Milan, deliberately making it cross-shaped. Because and this is in his text, he wanted to express the victory of Christ on the cross over the world. So that becomes then kind of the determinant shape. That's where we get that first basilican cross. This is, I thought I had an image of that Holy Apostles. That becomes the first church that kind of set the stage for basically the next 1,600 years or so of longitudinal basilicas with transepts imitating Christ on the cross. Well, we made it to about the year 382 so far. We're going to pick up the pace here a little bit more. Let me get a little sip here. A couple other things going on during this time. The theme of the church is the heavenly Jerusalem. Has a very interesting, there are many things that can be said about it. One of the instances is the Church of San Stefano Rotondo. Now, we see it today pretty much as this, which is really just this taller central drum surrounded by this lower central drum, and all of these other ancillary buildings are basically gone. I think there's still one little part that serves kind of as an entryway. In the patristic mind, this was an expression of the heavenly Jerusalem. Originally, the altar was not in the center, and a lot of people think, oh, this is a centralized building, this is evidence of liturgy in the round, and so forth. And it can't be defended, or it can't be used for that case. Actually, there were 4 different churches. This is actually cross-shaped, and there were 4 chapels around this central rotunda. But more interestingly is this is Sandro Ritz, who is a Jesuit archaeologist, based upon archaeological evidence quite away from the church. They've discovered that it was a huge precinct. And you can see the relationship here between that and like the tent of dwelling, where you have the tabernacle amidst this big enclosure, right? So this was for them an expression of the heavenly Jerusalem. I want to go to Ravenna now. San Vitale is one of my absolute favorite churches. It's very, very complicated. Has a lot of history to it, but I really enjoy it for its forms, its organic nature of these kinds of forms that we see here. The taller, the 2-story drum with the taller cupola, this chancel form cutting into it, the series of side chapels and pastafferys, like places for the deacons and the iconostas, or where the icons would be kept and so forth. It's just a wonderful, wonderful organic massing. But it's got a lot of history to it, and I think it's got a lot of meaning set in its time. Now, this building was built it started around the year 325. It's happening in Ravenna, which at the time was the seat of Theodoric, who was the Arian Visigoth king. This was the center of the Visigothic kingdom. And here, the Catholic party was starting to build again. Now, of course, we know that by this time, everything is happening in Constantinople, basically. Constantinople, Milan is a big city happening, but Rome is in just disrepair at this time. So Ravenna was a very important city because at the time it was actually on the coast. and the Eastern Empire wanted to maintain that take it as a toehold on the Christian, to reclaim the Italian peninsula. Theodoric, around the time this was being built, either he was tolerant of the Catholic party or he was just too weak to do anything about it. He died in 526, and the Arian Empire began to collapse at that point. By 540, the Byzantine army under Belisarius had seized Ravenna and had captured it. The Byzantine Empire then set up Ravenna as a major seat, the exarch, the representative of the emperor for the whole Western Empire. And then the Church of San Vitale was consecrated in 548. So this is all a time of great tumult. I've read in several occasions where San Vitale is the great statement of the Catholic doctrine against the Arians. What in the world does that mean? What could this building be teaching us about Catholicism versus Arianism? Arianism contained one kind of fundamental error, that for Arius, there was a time when the Son was not. That is, the Son, Christ, the Logos, was not eternally begotten of the Father, but in time came into being. Now, this was a very, very attractive understanding. In the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, at times, like half the bishops in the Catholic Church were Arians or semi-Arians. So if we think we have problems today, we can put that into perspective. Because of this claim, though, that the Son of God is not eternal and consubstantial with the Father and so forth, a whole series of things start to unwind. The sacrifice of the Mass, the Trinity. I mean, nothing else holds together if we don't have the Son as the Logos, the incarnate Word. So the Church Fathers are kind of grappling around with language to come to understand this and to express what's this relationship going on in the Trinity. One of the terms they use, and there are many forms of this, but it's perichoresis. The term means to dance about. Choreography is a common word we get from that. And it refers to this kind of mutual indwelling, this interpenetration, this a series of, like a network of relationships within the divine persons of the Trinity. Now, this term was principally used against the Arians, who held a hierarchical view that the Father was preeminent and the Son and the Holy Spirit were subordinate and dependent creatures, created by God. The hypostatic union, the idea that the development that we have, that the Son of God, the Word, has two natures in one person, is another term of perichoresis, trying to explain this complete interpenetration of the human and the divine in the person of Jesus. Now, keeping in mind that at the time, Ravenna was the center of this Ostrogothic Empire, it's not unreasonable to look for some clues in this building. It's a strongly, I would call it a Trinitarian building. We often see groups of three. I think the next slide here. Go to the plan. You have a series of three windows. There are these kind of three zones concentrically. There are these three end elements here. I mean, there's threes happening all over the place. But I don't think that, and then when we look inside the building, I don't have pictures of the mosaics, but they're all sacrificial themes. You have Melchizedek, the sacrifice of Melchizedek, the sacrifice of Abel, all these kind of very grand Eucharistic themes that are expressing the sacrificial nature of the Mass. What I think is going on here, though, is that the building itself is somehow an expression of perichoresis. And it's somehow an expression of trying to find a language that describes the immanent and the transcendent simultaneously. Now, in general, we looked at the Basilica, which is a very long, transcendent movement kind of architectural space. And immanence is often kind of enclosure, stasis. Okay? This building itself does both simultaneously, so that we have this profoundly strong axis mundi, this like, it's almost like a martyrion, like a baptistry, a site memorial, very static. But then this nave, or the chancel, cuts into that space, which we could see more clearly here. Okay? And I think what's going on here is they're trying to do something that addresses the Arian problem like in an architectural way. Now, the synthesis of these two forms, the immanent and the transcendent, in this building for me, they evoke kind of a harmonious balance and an integration between the principles of the incarnate humanity of Christ and the uncircumscribable, the indivisible, the invisible, the incomprehensible divinity of Christ, precisely against the claims of the Arian heresy. Now, as kind of a test case, we can look at another contemporaneous church of Hagia Sophia. Now, this is happening in Constantinople, and there were Arian bishops in Constantinople. This building was pretty much simultaneous, but you can see here they're doing kind of the same thing. They're creating this very longitudinal space, but it also has a really strong sense of containment. And it's a very ambiguous space architecturally. It's very complicated. So that depending on where you're standing, it could either look like a longitudinal basilica or this more kind of amorphous thing where the dome is moving into these half domes, into these apses and so forth, and it becomes a very kind of organic expression. So I think that's my estimation of what's going on at that church, and one of the powers, the fascinating things that attracts us to that kind of complex emotional space. We're going to really fast forward now. We're going to go to the Middle Ages. Not that things weren't happening, but they were often happening other places than the Italian peninsula. From about the year 800 or so, what Benedict of Nursia was that 780 or so, I think. The monasteries started to develop. And these often grew into towns. I mean, when these Benedictines were going out and claiming land, there was really nothing else out there. And so the whole monastic movement was very much civilizing Europe, not just the Italian peninsula, but it was really the growth of the cities as well. Here's Monte Cassino, which was bombed into practical oblivion during World War II, even though there was a pact, there was an agreement between the Germans and the Americans to not destroy this, but the Americans went ahead and blew it to smithereens. It's been rebuilt, thank God, but this is kind of emblematic for me. The Benedictines very much were the founders of modern Europe in terms of the cities. Paris was originally a Benedictine monastery. Oxford and Cambridge, these were all places of monastic life before they became university towns or other cultural business centers. One of the things about the Middle Ages that's intriguing to me is the baptistries that were built during the time. We all know the Leaning Tower over here. This is actually a much more fascinating building here, the baptistry. Why, in a time of, after Christianity had basically conquered the West. They're still building these very powerful, strong statements of baptism. There weren't adult baptisms. There weren't adult conversions going on by and large at this time. It was all infant baptisms. It has to do with the growing idea of the Italian city, the cittadina, or the citadel. The city was a sacred place like all of Italy. Rome had its founding myth, right, of Romulus. Many cities had myths about their founding. I don't know if they're true or not, but for instance, Bologna was held to have been laid out by its patron saint, Saint Petronio. The sanctity of the city was such that the cathedral, the Duomo, the domus, that was the house that represented the entire city. The bishop was the father of this city. The sanctity of the city was often proclaimed from the gates. In Vicenza, in 1262, the civic statutes, the fathers of the town had images of the Blessed Virgin, Saint Michael the Archangel, Saint Christopher, Saint Peter, and the blessed martyrs Felix and Fortunatus posted at the 5 city gates. So anyone coming into that town knew that this was a sacred place under the protection of those saints. In 1275, the mayor of Pisa had portraits of the Virgin and Saints Peter and Paul placed at all 4 gates of the city. Again, it's a sacred place. It's a place of refuge. It's a place of civilization. It's a place of culture. Apart from outside the city gates is the wilderness. It's a place of danger. It's a place for brigands and outlaws and people who are out and the ill and the dead and so forth. So this is an important theme. Now, as far as these baptistries, citizenship in the community itself was linked to the religious practice. In the 12th and 13th centuries, by being baptized in the bishop's font at Verona, granted rights of citizenship to be a citizen of Verona. Even Dante alludes to this fact in the Paradiso. He says, "To such a quiet, such a beautiful life of the citizen, so safe, to such a safe community, to so sweet an inn, a place to rest, did Mary give me, with loud cries invoked, and in your ancient baptistry together, Cacciaguida and I became Christian." Cacciaguida being his grandfather. That he claims his citizenship by having been baptized. A citizenship in the city and a citizenship in the kingdom of God. These were coterminous realities for the Middle Ages. Now, as far as the rest of the Middle Ages go, there's some gorgeous pieces, San Clemente being one of my favorite. The Italians are not known for their Gothic. The Duomo at Milan and the facade here is actually much later. This project was stalled for centuries. The plan was laid out according to one proportioning system, and they were trying to arrange the facade according to another proportioning system, and the masons couldn't agree, and the whole thing bogged down for years. So this facade, I think, is early 19th century, maybe late 18th. But we can see that this is a heavier, lumpen kind of building. It doesn't evoke the grace or the grandeur of the French cathedrals. I know Michael Wallachevich loves this building. It's still laid out according to a Gothic plan, with the transepts and the ambulatory around here. But the interior it's massive, it's heavy, it's kind of earthbound. It kind of lacks that kind of soaring verticality that we find in the French Gothic or the English Gothic. The Italian Gothic here, the Venetian Gothic, happening at St. Mark's in Venice, Very, very Byzantine, a very kind of hybrid thing, lacks the verticality of French Gothic or, kind of the major things. It's very much an Eastern kind of church. Gorgeous, but, something else is going on here than we normally think about when we talk about Gothic. There's one little church, a beautiful little gem in Rome, Santa Maria sopra Minerva. This is where Catherine of Siena is buried, Fra Angelico is buried, William Durandus is buried. And this is about the only really Gothic kind of expression that we find, in my estimation, for the better understanding of that, that we find in the Italian peninsula. And it's a lovely, lovely building, but even so, it's kind of dark and heavier. We're going to go into the Renaissance here now, and this is kind of a fun time to look, because this is really the height of the Italian genius. It's kind of significant that at the end of the Avignon papacy, for several hundred years, the papacy had vacated Rome, moved around before it finally settled in Avignon, and then there was a series of popes and anti-popes and so forth. All this came to a resolution in Constance in 1417, when Martin V was elected pope, and he was universally recognized. Well, this is Constance in modern-day Switzerland, so he took 3 years to get back to Rome. He took a year in Mantua, he took 2 years in Florence, where he set up the Curia. He wanted to make an elaborate homecoming, a triumphal entry into the city of Rome. So he and the cardinals started to clean up the churches, rebuild the basilicas that were in disrepair and so forth. And he brought on board just a wealth of just wonderful, wonderful artists, Ghiberti, Masaccio, Masolino, to repair these churches, to redecorate them and so forth. But while he's in Rome, this is the time when Brunelleschi is designing what is generally considered to be the first Renaissance building, the Hospital of the Innocents, recovering the images of classical antiquity. Okay? It's interesting, too, that one of the members of the Curia at the time, who was traveling, who was at the Council of Constance, and became the scribe of Martin V, was Poggio Bracciolini, who discovered in the monastery of St. Gall the texts of Vitruvius. And so these had been curated throughout the Dark Ages, which is a term I don't like, but had been kept in a monastery in Switzerland, and so these were brought to light. And suddenly there was this kind of new expansion of understanding of classicism that happened, coincidentally, through Martin V being elected, by Providence, Bracciolini being part of his entourage. So suddenly we see kind of a flourishing of ancient temple forms happening in the Renaissance, the early Renaissance. By the they started playing with these kind of forms. Already architects like Brunelleschi and so forth, they were going down to Rome, they were studying the ruins, they were transcribing and recording and measuring, and they were kind of rebuilding a vocabulary of sacred architecture. In the development of the ancient temple, this became kind of the prototype for the Renaissance architects. There's a problem with this in trying to reconcile the basilican form. This is Old St. Peter's before it was torn down, but the basilican form is essentially one or two aisles of columns with this taller clerestory with the taller central nave. There's a problem trying to reconcile this kind of a shape with the temple, which is normally a broader triangular front. So for the next 100 years or so, 200 years really, various architects are trying to solve this problem. Alberti at Santa Maria Novella kind of cheats a little bit with these little scrolls. right, to make up that difference. Sometimes they would kind of use just massive monumental orders. Sometimes they would stack two orders on top of one another. And it was just, this was like a problem for them trying to reconcile the ancient tradition of temple architecture, which they considered to be authentic, with the Christian basilica, trying to bridge between ancient ideas and Christianity. It was only in about the year, in the middle of the 16th century, that Palladio kind of hit upon the solution. This is Il Redentore, which is his last church, but you can kind of see how he overlays two temple orders here. A taller central temple and a smaller squatter temple. This is more clearly shown in San Giorgio Maggiore, where you can clearly see he has two orders here of temples. Now, kind of citing Joseph Rickwert, there's a really interesting thing going on with these churches too. Because one of Palladio's earlier, here's the interior, and we'll talk about the central dome here in a couple minutes. But one of the themes that Rickwert develops is this idea that here's the Villa Taine by Palladio, that this is sort of a house of human nature. This is a human-oriented building. And the taller central building is the divine edifice. Now, this is all happening right at the beginning of the Council of Trent, trying to find some answer to the problems raised by the Protestants. What Rickwert suggests is that superimposing this taller temple over this lower temple it not only accommodates these differing widths, heights, and proportions, it maintains the integrity of the facades, it expresses the unity of the two together, okay? But more importantly, it's this idea that the house of God encompasses, protects the house of man. That the role of the church is significant in protecting and sheltering human society. That under the care of the church, the house of nature is raised to an exalted state, mirrored and harmonized by the columns of the temple. So these Palladian buildings can be seen as kind of iconographically in the same tradition as San Vitale, expressing the importance of contemporaneous orthodoxy that were being attacked by the Protestant challenges. One is that the church is necessary for an ordered society, and two, that grace perfects nature. Now, the Renaissance is popularly understood as kind of the beginnings of secularism, where the study of anthropology replaces theology. We're all familiar with this famous Da Vinci drawing, where the human form is the microcosmic perfection of a greater order, perfectly circumscribed by the circle and the square. And in many ways, I think the circle is an appropriate emblem for thinking about the Renaissance. The study of the circle was central to Euclidean geometry. The growth of the natural sciences held the circle as an important organizing principle. The earth, the stars, many animals, the nests made by animals, all shared centralized or radial patterns. Alberti himself specifies that the honeycomb is a form in which nature delights. These notions were bound to affect church architecture, and in general, church architecture did tend to become more centralized during the Renaissance. Now, it should be remembered that the longitudinal early Christian basilica was kind of understood as an aberration of classical temple architecture. The classical tradition was that these were enclosed, immanent buildings. And the Renaissance men wanted to reestablish these universal traditions of sacred architecture. Some believe that from the evidence of antiquity that that classical temples were usually circular. Hence, there was sometimes a bias that clouded their research. Inigo Jones, for instance, placed Stonehenge as a Roman temple dedicated to Uranus. They were so captivated by the circularity that they would make these sometimes, well, today unsubstantiated or indefensible claims. Some thought that early Christian buildings were centralized liturgically as well, or that they were actually pagan temples that were later brought over to Christian use, such as we know the Pantheon, but they had thought that San Stefano Rotunda, Santa Costanza here, were all the Lateran baptistry, that these were basically pagan temples that became Christian, and that's that the authentic tradition was circularity. Now, the use of centralized forms also had a certain liturgical sense to it. The Renaissance is also in reaction to the medieval proliferation of altars, for instance, from the monastic and the Gothic expressions. So Alberti wanted to express the unity of the liturgy by giving the high altar its prominence and returning to the ancient practice of celebrating Mass once a day at the central altar. Quote, there would be one single altar where they would meet, the church, to celebrate no more than one sacrifice a day. This is Alberti talking. And Alberti, we're pretty sure he was a priest, interestingly. This theme has also, of course, been revived in modern post-conciliar liturgical discussions. And I don't think that's really not what history would indicate is happening. But with these understandings, we can see why the Renaissance architects wanted to return to the circle. Arguments from nature, the circle, of course, being a symbol of God. At once, it suggests form, it suggests unity, integrity, wholeness. A lot of the church fathers contemplated the circle. St. Augustine, for instance, saw it as a symbol of virtue because of integrity. Egil, another of the church fathers, saw it as a symbol of the church because the quantities of perfection, eternity, plenitude are all associated with the circle. So it was thought to be the proper shape for the church, but interestingly, churches weren't designed, not many churches were designed this way. In a strange conflation, though, kind of adding to the argument for circular buildings, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, a Muslim mosque, which has its antecedents in Byzantine architecture. This is often portrayed as the Temple of Solomon. And so there's this kind of, by this time, it was very difficult to travel to the Middle East. And so various accounts kind of inflame people's imaginations. The temple itself, well, the dome. This is the Dome of the Rock, which sits upon the site of the Temple of Solomon, later Herod's temple. But this was seen to be kind of an emblem of the Solomonic temple, and we'll get into that in a minute. Interestingly, this finds expression in the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel was proportioned according to the proportions of the Temple of Solomon. The proportions are 120 feet long, 40 feet high, and 60 feet wide. In 1 Kings, it says that the house which King Solomon built for the Lord, the length thereof was 80 cubits, 60 cubits, the breadth therefore 20 cubits, and the height thereof 30 cubits. So the same ratio of 12 to 4 to 6 is kind of, it was seen to be kind of a revealed ordering proportional system. So the Sistine is a rectangular room, but we see in it the famous painting by Perugino of the donation of the keys. This is kind of a problem for art historians in general, because We know, according to Scripture, that where the keys, when Peter was given the keys, this didn't happen in Jerusalem. This happens in Caesarea Philippi. Yet there's a lot of things going on here that suggest that this rather is happening in Jerusalem, and that this is the temple, and that therefore, obviously this is an age, 1480 or so, where the church is in great tumult. The Proto-Reformation is happening. The authority of Peter is being called into question and so forth. In the two friezes on these arches, which we don't have details of, in Latin it says, speaking to Pope Sixtus V, "You, Sixtus, are inferior to Solomon in riches, but superior to him in religion and devotion, consecrating this immense temple." So they're making a very strong papal claim here, and a claim of the continuation or the authority of Solomon in this thing. We see this in some images from the 15th century. These are maps of the Holy Land, where it actually says this is the Temple of Solomon. I don't know if you can really make that out. But they're looking at the Dome of the Rock and calling that the temple. So I think this has a pretty interesting interpretation. That being the case, really very few churches were actually centralized. The obvious case being Bramante's Tempietto. And in fact, the Tempietto here is circular, not for any liturgical reason. It's a site memorial, like a baptistry is a site memorial of the River Jordan. So it follows that traditional language of the martyrium. It's built to honor St. Peter's site of martyrdom. They were interested in this question of circularity and so forth, but it was really rather an age of the great domes, the domes of the church. The centralized structures were kind of expressed through these massive domes. They're commonly cruciform, like they could be Greek crosses, such as Santa Maria Consolazione, Santa Maria della Carcere, where we have these very compact buildings with these massive domes. So you consider the proportions. These are just very, very tall, soaring spaces. All you can really do is look up. But they're still ordered along an axis. Nowhere is this more evident than, it also happens though this is actually a Latin cross plan with a long nave and the transepts, yet still the dome at San Giorgio Maggiore is a dominant form. We see this at St. Peter's. That's the most obvious instance. This is Michelangelo's original design, which was modified from Bramante's plan, where the whole thing is meant to support this glorious dome overhead. It was only after the Council of Trent there was a sense of a return to the ancient tradition, the ancient Christian tradition of the basilica made by the council, that Pope Paul V asked that it be, commanded, that it be turned into a longitudinal basilica. Okay? We have to wonder what the history of church architecture would have been had he not done that, had the main dominant expression of Catholicism remained this kind of centralized Greek dome, a Greek plan with a centralized dome. But this was a very deliberate thing at the time of the Council of Trent, keeping with St. Charles Borromeo's instructions on the Christian antiquity of the... Borromeo saw that this longitudinal cruciform basilica was the ideal form for Christian worship. And he says that the centralized churches were considered to have distinctly pagan qualities and were already considered, quote, less customary among Christian people. So Borromeo is already kind of looking at this question of centralization, trying to get back to the roots of Christianity. Now, if the circle is the expression of the emblem of the Renaissance, I would suggest that the symbol of the Baroque age is the ellipse. We see these wonderful elliptical churches, such as Bernini's San Andrea Quirinale, built for the Jesuit novices. And of course, Bernini's grand statement of the Piazza San Pietro, this massive, massive ellipse, at which point here is one of the original, the whole basilica encompasses an area that used to be a Roman circus, which is where St. Peter was reportedly martyred. So this would have been one of the posts that the chariots would have gone around. So that's how they pointed that place right there. Why the ellipse? In the Baroque age, there's no more stasis. Europe has been torn to shreds by the Reformation, by the 30 Years' War. Everything's in motion. Politically, culturally, theologically, musically, architecturally. The ellipse at once, it's another one of those kind of statements of stasis and movement. It's both, has a transcendental, but also kind of an immanence to it. I think that's one of the fascinations with the shape for the Baroque age. We're going to fast forward to, this is another kind of cute little thing. I don't know if this is true or not, but this shape here being evocative of a keyhole for the keys of Peter. I don't know if that's Bernini. Bernini has that drawing, a very famous one of like the arms reaching out to embrace all of humanity. But these Baroque geniuses are working on many, many different levels simultaneously. Well, we're going to go up ahead here, kind of wrap up here, look at the 20th century. Vestigially, basilican. Is it a church? Is it a concrete factory? I don't know. Mangiarotti has this kind of exercise in minimalism built in the late 50s for the Church of Mercy, the Mother of Mercy in Baranzate. Very, very minimalist. Right? Just the box. There's a recent church just built in Munich, Sacred Heart Church, that is this almost exactly to a T. And that was just built, and this thing is already a 50-year-old building, so modernism doesn't really seem to be all that progressive, and they kind of get stuck in ruts too, I think. The Italians, though, often have this penchant for expressionism. This is the Madonna della Autostrada by Michelucci. It's on the confluence of the road between going from Florence towards Padua. Our Lady of the Toll Road, I guess, is another name. The interior is very strange. In fact, I don't have a plan of this, but this is kind of the aisleway. You come in over here and you go across there. And so the altar is here and the nave is here. And so it's got these kind of, I don't know, some, what would you call it, tendrils or something. It looks very sinewy to me. Too rare, I think, is the kind of the brilliance of like a Carlos Scarpa, who, if you ever get to anywhere between Verona and Venice, is the cemetery of Brianvega, and which is just, it's done in concrete. It's amazing use of detailing. This is really just a funerary chapel. It's not really a church per se, but it's really a delightful place to discover. If you ever get anywhere near that, this is probably, for modern architecture, it's the height of Italian sacred architecture in the 20th century. Unfortunately, more emblematic for me of the Italian problem is things like this. Well, it was never realized. It was never realized, as you can see why. I just came across this in a book on Italian church architecture. It's 1958. It was called a Catholic Community Center. Is it a water park? Is it a Hot Wheels track? You know, if I was a kid, I could have my little toy cars all over that thing. But don't ask. To kind of conclude, I wanted to show a recent instance of what's going on in church architecture today in Italy. This is a monumental, momentous time of the Church of the Jubilee. Now, in 1995, the Vatican asked 6 major league architects to design churches for them, to design a church that would be the Jubilee Church, the church that represents the Grand Jubilee, the 2000th anniversary of the Incarnation. The Jubilee architecture is a fascinating study. The first Jubilee was in the Holy Year was in 1300. So, like all of these grand projects by Borromini and by Bernini are all part of Jubilee endowments by the papacy. It's a wonderful, wonderful history. The Sistine Chapel was built under Sixtus V as his contribution to the Jubilee. This is what we got. Now, the church invited 6 major architects, 3 Jews, Richard Meyer, Peter Eisenman, and Frank Gehry, a Shintoist, Tado Ando, a post-Lutheran, Günter Benisch, and what I don't know this, he's nominally Catholic, Santiago Calatrava, to somehow express what architecture should be saying and what the church should be saying to the modern world. This project by Richard Meyer is the winner, and I think I'll show you the other projects. I think this is the better of them all. Very plain, very austere. I mean, for Meyer, this is a break because he really gets down with these kind of forms here. Normally, it's very rectilinear, but he's really, and this is really a fascinating space because inside you get these kind of concave things going on here. Just why? Yeah, because he can. He can. This is the project by Tado Ando. This is in a lot of ways the least successful of them all. Ando just didn't get it. For one thing, you can see in plan, this is his site model. He has this subterranean courtyard, which would be nice, but for some reason he thinks that we're all monks, walking around our cloister. This triangular shaped building actually steps down. So this is actually going down from one level up here down there. So it drops like a full story. It's raked seating that kind of pinches in. I can't imagine a bridal procession trying to carry a casket up and down this thing. I mean, it makes no sense. But it's subordinating the liturgy and Catholic culture to kind of a preconceived idea. Günter Benisch's project here, the church is a park, basically. No, I'm serious. His deliberate intention here was to be non-hierarchical, non-confrontational, no facade, no recognizable form. It's a series of pavilions that happen within a park-like setting. Okay, so here is, you can see the plan, a little kind of circular, semicircular seating here. These all open up to let the breezes through, lots of nice trees. He was disqualified for this, probably not for the reasons you think, simply because this was the site here that they were given to work with. And he wanted to include this space as well. These are 2 big apartment buildings, as you see in the background. Okay, so he was disqualified because he transcended the boundaries of the competition. Okay. Frank Gehry, who did the Bilbao Museum. Are you familiar with that? And he's recently done the Disney Hall in D.C. or in Los Angeles. This, to me, if you're going to go with a postmodern, deconstructivist kind of thing, it's better than most. He's got some identifiable elements, such as the campanile, and kind of parts to a whole relationship here. He's got kind of the strange device here of breaking the nave into two, focusing on the altar, so the body of Christ is kind of divided. Maybe it's the analogy of two lungs, I don't know, but he was actually the second contender. He took second place in this competition. Not, for what he's trying to do, I don't know. Does anyone think this looks like a church? Would you?
It has a door.
There's a door. It doesn't even have like a cross on it. Calatrava. Recently he did the museum in Milwaukee where he uses the same device. Okay, I mean, he has these, his statement is this kind of herringbone-shaped seating in this apse, in kind of an ellipse. A rather complicated series of roof struts that kind of open out like that to welcome people. Come to church. Liturgically, it doesn't work very well. As a piece of sculpture in the landscape, I think it's a gorgeous thing, absolutely gorgeous. Maybe those are the wings of the Holy Spirit. I don't know. We can interpret these things any way we want. This is my favorite, actually. Peter Eisenman. He's the dean of deconstructivist architects. His theory and his whole approach on this building was, this is no longer a church in the agrarian age. This is no longer a church in the industrial age. This is a church in the age of communication. What is should be the great symbol we have for communication? The liquid crystal. Plasma displays, LCD, the whole bit. Pardon? Okay. His theory is that in the age of communication, the symbol is the liquid crystal. Now, the liquid crystal is a great trope for deconstruction because, and I'm not a physicist, so if there are any physicists here, you can join in. But the liquid crystal is indeterminate until it congeals at a particular state. So there's no reality, there's no language, it's all whatever it turns out to be at the end. So what he did is he played with these kind of liquid crystal forms on the microscopic scale and just enlarged it, 12,000 times to get something that approximates the size of a church. So we have here this kind of canyon, and we have two naves, one here and one here. And the sanctuary is in the center. And here you could actually see the shape of that site, so the buildings are framing it. So he uses the whole site, and even his parking is kind of jagged, takes the crystalline form. We talk about form versus function here. And so here are the two naves, and in the center is the sanctuary. Now, you can't always see the altar from the naves. That's not a problem for him because he'll just have big screen TVs. Again, the liquid crystal, the age of communication, right? These naves don't communicate with each other, and they don't communicate with the sanctuary in the center. You can't get there from here. I think he's denying sacramental reality. I think this is about as far away from a Catholic understanding of sacramental reality as you can get. Very deliberate. Why the Pope invited him, it's a different question. But that's basically the state of Catholic architecture at the highest levels in Italy. So I want to thank you for your time. I hope this has been, you've enjoyed the journey with me.